Hi everybody, welcome back to the Desmond Works channel, and as promised today is a video about my Ducati 748 Thunderbike race suspension setup, or i.e. the base geometry setup. So when I talk about geometry, we're talking about the physical attributes of the bike and how they interact with one another. So fork angle, swing arm angle, the wheel sizes, the wheelbase length, fork height, etc., because they all have an impact on rake, trail and wheelbase. We're not talking today about suspension settings, and to be clear, suspension settings is dealing with rebound and compression damping, preloads, static sag, rider sag, because that's a separate subject and I don't want to confuse the two subjects. So today all I'm going to be focusing on is base geometry setting for a Ducati. So the areas that we can adjust, because if you go into the realms of suspension setup for a, let's say, a GP level bike, you can change pretty much every fundamental geometry setting on the bike. We don't have that capability on the Ducati, so I'm going to be focusing on what I can change from a geometry point of view and putting in the settings that I like. Now, to be very clear, suspension is all about, or sorry, handling, let's say, because suspension is a part of handling. Handling is all about feeling. So what I'm going to do today might not work for you as a rider. Conversely, if I was to ride your bike and the way you had it set up, it might not work for me, because it's that personal feeling in a bike that enables you to go fast on it. So all I'm going to do today is talk about some of the basics on geometry, and then talk about the settings that I put into a Ducati 748, 916, 996 and 998 series bike. Why those four? Because the chassis is the same. Because if I was doing it to another Ducati bike, it would be different again. So if I did it to a 749 or a 999, it would be different. And if I did it to an 848, a 1098 or 1198, again it would be different, because you're dealing with different chassis constructions. Not the overall construction as in trellis frame, but the componentry construction and the inputted factory angles of things like rake and trail and swing arm position, etc. So that's what we're going to be doing today. This subject can go absolutely crazy if you really want to get into it and really understand the handling of your bike. So if you wanted to get more and more detail around what I'm going to be talking about today, there are a number of good books about. Now, I was recommended one when I was on my suspension course, which is this, which is Race Tech's Motorcycle Suspension Bible. This has everything from chassis and suspension basics all the way through to basic colour guides on how to service the most common types of suspension around at the moment. There's also some really nice stuff at the end about common terminology and some handling suspension build sheets that you can sort of copy and use to put your own settings in. Really good book. It is, wow, didn't realise I paid that much for it. £23 or £22.50 and 35 US dollars, but really good book. Okay, so let's get onto the bike and let's do it. Okay, let's talk about rake and trail. So I'm going to use this straight edge, or relatively straight. Right, if you imagine that's giving me a vertical line through my contact patch on the ground, through the centre of the wheel and then up. If you now imagine the steering axis comes down, crosses through that vertical line, you have two key areas that we're focused on from a front geometry piece. The angle between your steering axis and this vertical imaginary line, that is your rake angle, okay? Where your steering axis then intersects with the ground creates your trail measurement. So trail, rake. If you change the rake you'll also impact the trail. And that trail measurement down there is called ground trail. There is another term called real trail, but that is a scientific calculation so that you can calculate things like lever forces in the setup of your suspension and righting forces, etc. We're only focusing on the basic geometry setups. So another measurement you'll hear talked about in geometry terms is offset. Now, where we've been talking about our rake and trail angles, that's been based upon this steering axis line that goes down just behind the forks. And you'll notice that whilst it looks like we've got quite a large rake angle, we have a very small trail measurement. That's because Ducati have built offset into the bike. So the centre line of the forks, which gives us the centre of our axle and wheel and determines where the contact patch for the wheel is further forward in the bike because of offset. i.e. if you have more offset, you will reduce the trail, therefore increasing instability, i.e. it's easier to turn in, but lengthening the wheelbase, so gaining back a little bit of stability. If you had zero offset or a negative offset, you would actually move the contact patch back, therefore would be increasing the trail, and increasing the trail would increase stability but make the bike much harder to turn. But on the flip side, you'd be shortening the wheelbase, so you'd actually reintroduce a little bit of instability back. How can I show you that offset? Well, it's easier to go and look at the top of the bike and see what we've got on the yokes. Okay, so most bikes deliver offset via the yokes. So the piece that I was referring to, this is your steering axis, but the forks are offset from the steering axis. So if you imagine if there was a line going through the centres of the forks here, and then a parallel line going through the centre of the yoke, the distance between those two lines is the offset for the bike. Okay, and if you increase that offset, you will reduce the ground trail. If you decrease the offset, you will increase the ground trail. How can we adjust rake and trail on the bike? So on really fancy race bikes, they'll have all sorts of offset adjustments, steering head angle adjustments, as well as what they can then do with the length of the fork legs. On a Ducati, we don't have any way of adjusting the offset on the standard yokes. We do, however, on this type of frame, as you'll see here, we have an adjustment to be able to go between two rake settings. They have what they call a road setting and a race setting. The road setting is 24.5 degrees. The race setting is 23.5 degrees. 23.5 degrees being steeper than the 24.5 degrees. The other piece you can do to make minor adjustments to your rake is you can actually drop the bike or raise the bike through the fork legs. So you can move the fork leg up and down in the yoke, which is a common piece that you hear people say that they drop the fork legs through. And what that does is it just adjusts the angle of rake ever so slightly. I suppose if I did this mathematically and made some measurements, I'd be able to tell you what the impact of that is, but I'm not going to go into that level of detail because I do it all on feel, because it's all about how you feel on the bike, and you'll hear that phrase with racers a lot, how the bike feels. Now, if you wanted to adjust the trail on this bike, the only thing that you could do is change the tyre size. And when I say the tyre size, I mean the profile of the tyre. So this is a 70 profile front tyre, but you can get 65s. Now, by changing the profile, you change the overall diameter of the wheel. And because you change that diameter, you actually impact the trail slightly. So this has got a really steep rake angle at the moment. So from stock, which is normally the bike is in line with that first line on the fork leg there. The previous owner has dropped these fork legs almost 10 millimeters from spec, whereas I would normally drop it 5 millimeters from spec. So they've also got it in the fast or race setting. So they've got 23.5 degrees, but actually have dropped it through even further. So this bike would be very, very, what the term is, nose happy. So it would turn in really, really easy, but would be unstable in the turn, and also probably slightly unstable in a straight line. And when we're down here, remember that your rake angle affects your trail length, so they're directly tied to one another. So making an adjustment on the rake makes an adjustment on the ground trail. All right. Okay, so let's talk about race setup and how I like to set my bikes up. So Ducati has on these adjustable frames, and you can tell this is an adjustable one because it's a detent bolt and 2 lock bolts, one at the bottom there, one at the top. And they have 2 angles, 24.5 degrees of rake and 23.5 degrees of rake. How can you tell which is which? If you look at where the yoke spindle sits in relation to the steering head, if it's further towards the front, you are in the race setting, 23.5 degrees. If the yoke spindle is towards the rear, you are in the road setting. So we are in the front of the steering head, so we're in the race setting, which is 23.5 degrees of rake. This is the setting I like to have. If you wanted to adjust it, all you do is you undo the 2 lock bolts, remove the detent bolt, being very careful because it's aluminium and it's got a fine thread on it, so it can strip. And then you turn the steering tube in the frame through 180 degrees via a C-spanner such as this. So you would effectively put that on there and turn it through 180 degrees. I'm not going to do that because this is in the position that I like, and I get very nervous about taking these aluminium detent bolts out because they do have a tendency to strip very easily, and they're quite expensive and quite rare to get second hand now, so I'm not going to unnecessarily do this. What I have noticed in looking at this though is there are no washer and circlip holding these 2 bolts in, so you should have a setup like this. So you should have a washer with this circlip like that, in that order, that acts as a lock stop for those 2 bolts backing themselves out. So I need to get those because I've only got this one spare one lying around, so I need to get another couple of those. So not in a position to do that. The other setting I like to do to adjust the rake a little bit more is I like to drop this set of forks through the forks tubes by 2 of these lines, which is, in rough terms, 10 millimeters. If you look at that, the setting in here is 15, so it's quite steep. That's not how I like to have the set of bike. So I'm going to push the forks back down into the yoke, or pull the yoke up, so that I can get to that second line position. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to undo the top clamps, and we're going to have to undo the lower bridge or lower yoke bolts, depending on how you like to phrase it. Challenge is, with all the weight on the front, that would just cause the frame to drop. So I've got it on a workshop stand. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to weight down the rear because it pivots on the swing arm axis here. I'm going to pivot that to take the weight off the front so I can just move those forks up through. Okay, so let's get that done. Right, so you'll see that because I've got a bit of weight pulled down on the rear, so the weight's off the front, as I've loosened it all off, it's dropped right down. So what I'm going to do is pull the forks back up to the second line on the fork outer tube, which is where I'd like to get it to, and then I'll just clamp off the top top yoke just to hold it in place. Okay, so they're now just showing that second line there, which is 10mm worth on the fork, and again just there 10mm as well. What I've got to do now, tighten these up, 23 Newton meters, 14 Newton meters. Once I've got that in place, I'll then just loosen off the clip-on bolts, move those up, and then just tighten those back up as well. Okay, so front suspension geometry has been done, and it's just to summarise what we've done. The steering head angle is at 23.5 degrees because it's on the race setting that gives us the steeper rake setting. And we've also added an extra little bit of rake adjustment by just dropping the forks through from their standard setting by 5mm. Obviously the previous owner had it through 15, so I've in effect brought it back out. So that's at 10mm. We're not making any adjustment to the size of the wheel, so we won't be affecting the trail at all. And as discussed earlier, we can't adjust the offset. So that's the front end done for my bike. Let's now look at the rear end. So geometry wise, what we can do on the rear end is we can adjust the ride height via the linkage here, and we can adjust the wheelbase and the ride height by the position of the rear hub. The basic advice is keep this in the lowest setting and as far back as you can so you can keep the wheelbase longer. Make all your height adjustments via your height adjuster on the suspension rocker. So how do we measure the rear ride height? This is a copy of the official Ducati tool that gives you a fixed position to be able to measure the height, the rear ride height. Now the manual states that you should do it with the suspension fully extended, i.e. the weight should be off the bike, so you should lift the bike so that the wheel is just dropped and dangling its own way. But I've done my settings for a long time now with the bike sat on its own weight. Now that measurement from the center point of the axle to the top point of the tool, for me, I like to have that at 235mm loaded, i.e. the bike sat on its wheels. So you'll see that the previous owner has got quite an excessive rear ride height in as well. So this is reading 252mm. Now bearing in mind that the the extended height for the Ducati manual says 238mm, so this is very, very high at the rear end, and I'll talk about the impact of that in a second, but let me just make the adjustment to bring this into where I'd like it. So what I've done is I've released the lock-in bolts, nuts on the ride height adjuster, and now I'm just going to turn that central tube to adjust the ride height. Okay, let me do that. Okay, so adjustment made, locked off the height adjuster, and I'm getting 235mm rear ride height. So I've had to bring the rear ride height down again from what the previous owner had in it, so he had it very tail happy. So I've actually taken a little bit of rake off by making this adjustment. So if you imagine, the bike would have been very, very high up, so you would have been decreasing the rake angle even further, reducing the trail even further, so very, very nose happy. That's now got 235 in it, which is my preferred setting, so I've taken rake off because I've dropped the rear ride height that's pulled the bike back up a little bit. Now there's something else that you're impacting when you're making a rear geometry height setting around the swinging arm. Let me explain what that is. So when you are making a rear ride height adjustment, there's a couple of pieces that you're affecting. You're affecting the rake on the front end, so therefore the trail of the bike. You're also altering the anti-squat angle of the bike. What's the anti-squat angle? That's the bit that stops the bike wheeling under power. So how do you equate what the anti-squat angle impact is? So if you wanted to do it mathematically, you could work out your squat angle by drawing two lines on the rear of the bike. You have the first one, which is the center of your swing arm that comes through the hub center of the wheel, through your swing arm pivot point and forwards. You then have the chain run line, or the top of the chain run line, that goes from the top of your sprocket at the rear through the front of the sprocket and crosses across your swing arm center line, and that gives you a point of incidence somewhere around here. I'm pointing without having any graphics at the moment. You can now calculate what your squat angle would be, or your rear squat angle. So if you take a line from the point of incidence down to your rear contact patch, you will be able to use that line plus the ground line to work out what the squat angle of the bike is. So if you were to change your rear ride height, and therefore the angle that the swing arm sits at, you will change the point of incidence between the chain top run and the swing arm center line, and that would have a direct impact on your squat angle at the rear of the bike. Bigger the squat angle, the more impact you have on preventing the bike from wheeling. So it means that you've basically extended the swing arm further down, so it needs to compress more before the bike would start to lift at the front, okay, in its most basic sense. And that is how you adjust the rear end of the bike on a Ducati. Rear ride height tune, that affects the front rake again, affects the trail as well, but you also have an impact on the rear squat angle, which stops it from wheeling. That's it in a nutshell. Hope that one makes sense as well. Okay, so that's it hopefully for this video. So what I've shown you there is some of the key geometry phrases that you'll hear talked about when making bike adjustments. So rake, trail and offset, and the impact that they have at the front of the bike. I've then also had a slight conversation around wheelbase, just talking about the slight changes that would have on stability. I've then told you how I put the settings in for what I want on the Ducati as I like to ride it. And remember, handling is all about personal feel. So you're welcome to use those settings, but they might not feel very nice for you. And that is, I have the steering head angle at 23.5 degrees. I drop the front forks through the yokes by 10 millimeters. And then at the rear of the bike, I also talked about rear ride height, where I input 235 millimeters using the Ducati tool with the bike loaded, i.e. on the weight of its own wheels, etc. And then I've talked about the impact that that adjustment has. So it impacts the rake again at the front of the bike, and therefore the trail, because they're directly related to one another. And it has an impact upon the anti-squat angle of the bike, and I showed you how that anti-squat angle is calculated, so if you wanted to delve into that, you could understand the basics. I've tried to keep it as simple as I can, talking about suspension adjustment with a little bit of an overview of what you're doing in those adjustments. I hope that makes sense. As I said, there's different ways to make adjustments to the bike depending on where you want the adjustments to be and the impact that you want to have, because with every adjustment you make at the front or the rear of the bike, you are going to impact the other side of the bike. And that's why you can get the same sort of output in terms of settings by adjusting slightly different things on the bike. If you've got any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them down below, and I'll try my best to answer them in as a simple way as I can. Please give me a like on the video, and if you're not subscribed to the channel, please hit that subscribe button, because about half of my viewers are not subscribers, so it'd be great to see you actually join the channel. Thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed that one. See you at the next video. Cheers then, bye.